Whispers of the Ancients, Episode 15, the Ashanti Empire, Gold War, and the Golden Stool approximately 1670 to 1902 CE, Segment 1, in the forests of gold and thunder, amid the thick green canopies of the central Ghanaian rainforest, where golden sunlight dances through damp leaves and rivers wind like silver serpents. The Ashanti rose not by accident, but by design. Their roots spread across the rich forest soils of the Akan heartland. Among people who knew the worth of gold and the price of unity, theirs was a world of sacred trees, talking drums, and ancestral wisdom where power flowed not only from sword or treasure, but from story and stool. The rise of the Ashanti was not merely the tale of a people, but the emergence of an idea that a kingdom could be built not just on conquest, but on cohesion. Before them, the Akan peoples had lived in loosely affiliated city-states and chiefdoms, sometimes united in trade, often divided in rivalry. But in the 17th century, something stirred down urgency, a vision, a myth that would bind them all together. Segment 2, Osei and the Divine Founding. Around 1670, a visionary emerged from the town of Kumasi. His name was Osei, and his destiny would alter the course of West African history. Born into the royal Oyoko clan, Tutu was more than just a warrior king. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and a spiritual unifier. He forged alliances through cunning and strength, absorbing nearby chiefdoms under a single cause, the unification of the Akan. But he did not do it alone. His closest confidant and spiritual advisor was the high priest Okomfo Anaki, a legendary figure said to possess mystical powers. Together, they laid the ideological foundation of the Ashanti Empire. But their most enduring act came in the form of a miracle, the conjuring of the Golden Stool. Segment 3, the Golden Stool descends. According to legend, Okomfo Anaki called down the Golden Stool from the heavens in front of the assembled chiefs. It floated gently down, glowing with spiritual authority. This was no mere throne. The stool, covered in gold and sacred design, contained the soul of the Ashanti people past, present and future. No one, not even the king, could sit upon it. It was not a symbol of a ruler's power, but of the people's unity. From that moment on, the Golden Stool became the heart of the empire. Loyalty to it surpassed family, clan, or town. Betrayal of the stool was treason. Protection of it was destiny. With the chiefs swearing allegiance to the stool and to Osei, the Ashanti Empire was born, rooted not only in military might, but in spiritual consensus. Segment 4, Kumasi, the Golden Capital. As the capital of the Ashanti Empire, Kumasi grew rapidly into a political, cultural, and economic hub. Its broad avenues were lined with palm trees and thatched palaces. At the city's heart was the royal palace constructed of timber and clay, richly adorned with gold and ivory and guarded by elite soldiers and advisors. Kumasi thrived on the gold trade. The Ashanti lands were rich in gold dust, which was measured in brass weights and traded with both African neighbors and European merchants along the coast. Gold financed the army, the priesthood, and the bureaucracy. It was also a symbol of spiritual power, adorning statues, jewelry, and sacred objects. Markets buzzed with artisans, goldsmiths, weavers, leather workers. Drums echoed through the air with coded messages. Griots sang of past kings, victories, and betrayals. Kumasi was not just a city, it was a living archive of Ashanti heritage. Segment 5, Governance and a Council of Elders. Ashanti governance was built on balance and consensus. At the top stood the Asantehene, the king, whose power was immense but not absolute. His authority was checked by the Asanteman Council, composed of paramount chiefs from across the empire. This council functioned as a senate, court, and advisory body. It ensured that no ruler could act alone. Even the Asantehene could be removed if he violated his oath to protect the people and the stool. Laws were codified through oral tradition and passed by deliberation, ensuring that governance reflected both royal authority and communal wisdom. At the village level, local chiefs maintained order, reported to regional authorities, and paid tribute to Kumasi. The system was hierarchical yet interconnected, allowing for both autonomy and unity. Segment 6, the military machine of the Ashanti. the Ashanti maintained one of the most formidable military systems in West Africa. The army was well organized, disciplined, and motivated both by loyalty to the stool and the promise of wealth through victory. Commanders were drawn from noble clans and trained from youth. Soldiers carried muskets acquired from European traders, but also relied on traditional weapons, swords, spears and bows, war drums, horn signals and messengers ensured coordination across units. Military campaigns were frequent both to suppress rebellion and to expand influence. Victories brought slaves, gold and tribute. Defeats were rare but deeply analyzed. The Ashanti army was not just a force of destruction, it was an instrument of statecraft. Segment 7. The slave trade, a dark bargain. Despite their cultural brilliance, the Ashanti Empire was deeply enmeshed in the Atlantic slave trade. Like many African states of the era, they captured prisoners of war and sold them to European traders in exchange for guns, cloth, and liquor. The coastal forts Elmina, Cape Coast, and others were the interface between the Forest Kingdom and the Atlantic world. The Ashanti had no direct coastline, but they controlled the interior routes. Their grip on trade allowed them to extract tribute from coastal states and control supply chains. The human cost was devastating. Families were torn apart. Entire villages vanished. The Ashanti justified it as part of the spoils of war, but the trauma echoed through generations. Segment 8. Cultural richness and the role of the griots. The Ashanti were custodians of a deeply layered cultural legacy. At the center of this heritage stood the griots, oral historians, musicians and keepers of memory. They preserved royal genealogies, narrated battles, and recited proverbs that shaped public morality. The Ashanti language, Twi, became the vehicle for law, poetry and ritual. Folk tales about the trickster Anance the spider taught children moral lessons. While entertaining them with wit and imagination, gold weights carried symbolic meanings. Kente cloths woven in complex patterns communicated social rank, lineage and emotion. Festivals like a day celebrated the ancestors and the power of the stool. Drumming, dancing and sacrifice marked the sacred calendar. The Ashanti saw themselves not just as a kingdom, but as a people with divine purpose. Segment 9. Resistance and conflict with the British. By the 19th century, British ambitions in West Africa began to clash with Ashanti sovereignty. The British sought to expand their control over the Gold Coast, especially its lucrative trade routes. The Ashanti resisted fiercely. A series of wars erupted, beginning with skirmishes in the early 1800s and culminating in the brutal Anglo-Ashanti Wars. In 1824, they defeated British forces at the Battle of Nsomonco, killing Governor Charles McCarthy. But the tide turned as Britain modernized its forces and tightened its grip on coastal forts. Still, the Ashanti would not yield easily. When Britain demanded to see or seize the Golden Stool, the Ashanti saw this not as politics but sacrilege. Segment 10. The Ashanti Wars, rivalries on the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was no monolith. While the Ashanti Empire grew in power and prestige, rival kingdoms like the Fanti Confederacy eyed its expansion with suspicion and resistance. What followed was a series of bitter wars that pitted Akan-speaking peoples against each other, not just over territory, but over control of trade routes and influence in coastal politics. The Fanti, strategically aligned with British interests, often stood as a buffer between European coastal forts and Ashanti influence. The Ashanti, seeking to secure direct access to European goods and markets, launched numerous expeditions to challenge Fanti dominance, particularly in the mid-18th and early 19th centuries. These wars were brutal and protracted. Victories were rarely absolute, and the dense terrain of the southern forests made campaigns grueling. Towns shifted hands, trade was disrupted. Yet these conflicts highlighted the resilience of indigenous politics. Neither side could fully dominate the other for long, and despite internal tensions, Ashanti identity remained intact, fortified by a sense of divine mission centered around the Golden Stool. The Fanti-Ashanti rivalries also revealed the complexities of African diplomacy. Local kingdoms didn't merely submit to colonial forces or wait to be conquered. They made alliances, broke treaties, negotiated with Europeans as sovereign powers even as they fought each other. The Gold Coast was a chessboard of overlapping loyalties, ambitions, and betrayals. In the end, these internal struggles weakened both powers just enough to make them vulnerable to the rising tide of European colonization. But during the height of the Ashanti Wars, they stood as evidence of a continent not passive, but passionately political, its people determined to define their own futures. Segment 11, the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, Gold, Empire and Resistance. By the early 19th century, another threat loomed larger than any African rival. Britain expanding its imperial reach and seeking firm control of West African trade viewed the Ashanti not as a partner, but as an obstacle. What followed were 5 wars between the Ashanti Empire and British forces, beginning in 1823 and culminating in 1900. These weren't mere skirmishes. They were full-scale military campaigns marked by shifting tactics, betrayals, and extraordinary acts of courage on both sides. The First Anglo-Ashanti War 1823–1831 erupted after the death of British Governor Charles Macarthy during an Ashanti ambush, a moment that stunned London. The Ashanti temporarily reclaimed territory but failed to fully dominate the coast. The Second and Third Wars 1863 and 1873–1874 saw increasing British resolve. In 1874, after fierce fighting, the British under Sir Garnet Wolseley stormed and burned Kumasi, looting palaces and symbols of Ashanti power. Yet even this destruction didn't break the spirit of the empire. The Ashanti rebuilt. They persisted. The Fourth War in 1895 was swift and almost bloodless. Britain, now confident and equipped with modern weapons, annexed the Ashanti lands, declaring them part of the Gold Coast colony. Still, Kumasi smouldered with quiet rage. Then, in 1900, came the final stand, the War of the Golden Stool, when British Governor Frederick Hodgson demanded to sit on the sacred stool. A symbol of Ashanti nationhood, it triggered a rebellion, led by one of Africa's most revered heroines, Asantewaa, Queen Mother of Ijisu. Segment 12, Asantewaa and the War of the Golden Stool. Yeah, Asantewa's name resounds like thunder across West African history. Elderly, yet fierce, she rose when Ashanti men hesitated. In a legendary speech, she challenged them, "If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will." And so she did. Asantewaa rallied warriors, fortified Kumasi, and launched a campaign to protect the sacred Golden Stool, not just a throne, but the soul of the Ashanti people. The British, caught off guard, were besieged in Kumasi for months. Reinforcements eventually broke the siege, and Asantewaa was captured and exiled to the Seychelles. Yet her defiance became eternal. The war may have ended in military defeat, but symbolically, the Ashanti had triumphed. They had refused to surrender their soul. The Golden Stool was never found by the British. It remained hidden, untouched. Sacred proof that some symbols could never be colonized. Segment 13, Colonial Rule and Cultural Resilience. With the final defeat in 1901, the Ashanti Empire was officially annexed into the British Gold Coast colony. Traditional governance structures were stripped of real power, chiefs were made subject to colonial authorities, and taxes imposed from abroad reshaped the economy. Yet even under colonial rule, Ashanti culture did not vanish. The royal family continued to exist in symbolic form. Festivals, drumming rituals, kente cloth, and oral storytelling persisted, quiet flames in a storm of change. The British underestimated the resilience of Ashanti social systems. Extended family clans remained strong. The memory of Asantewaa, Prempa I, and other heroes endured. The Golden Stool was eventually restored to its caretakers, ensuring continuity of the people's spiritual foundation. Kumasi, though transformed by colonial architecture and policies, remained a cultural stronghold. Ashanti resistance became a source of pride not just for the Ashanti, but for all Africans seeking to reclaim dignity under foreign rule. Segment 14, Legacy of the Ashanti Empire. Today, the legacy of the Ashanti is embedded in the DNA of Ghana. The modern Ashanti region, centered on Kumasi, is both a cultural capital and a living museum of African royalty. The Ashanti, though now a ceremonial figure, still holds profound respect, serving as a unifying symbol of identity. The Golden Stool is never sat upon. It rests in its sacred chamber, visible only to a select few, and its story continues to be passed down not in dusty museums, but in vibrant drumbeats, dances, and the voices of griots who still sing of Asantewa, of Prempa, and the wars fought in defense of honor. The Ashanti Empire's gold-fueled economies beyond Africa, its resistance inspired movements across the continent, and its survival even in symbolic form proves that empires can fall in body, but live on in spirit. Ashanti history, like the stool itself, is sacred, carved from wood and spirit, gilded in memory, and held aloft by generations determined to never forget. Segment 15, The Clash of Thrones, British Ambitions and the Ashanti Resistance. The turn of the 19th century marked a turbulent era in West Africa. European imperial interests, fueled by the greed for gold, strategic control, and an empire's insatiable appetite, now gazed firmly on Ashanti lands. The British, expanding northward from their coastal strongholds in the Gold Coast, sought to neutralize the Ashanti threat and absorb its immense wealth and resources. Tensions had already sparked a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Ashanti War's 5 major wars. Spanning the 19th century, the Ashanti, wielding formidable military traditions and a warrior ethos honed over centuries, met British incursions with calculated resistance. But this was no longer a war between equals. British forces now wielded breech-loading rifles, artillery and steamboats for rapid deployment, while the Ashanti clung to imported muskets and bravery born from ancestral pride. Still, the Ashanti did not fall easily. Each invasion was met with unyielding resistance, ambushes in dense forests, skirmishes in villages, and sieges around fortified cities. In 1824, the Ashanti achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Nsamanko, where they routed a British column and killed Governor Sir Charles McCarthy. Skulls of slain enemies were said to adorn the walls of Kumasi, symbols of defiance, and proof of a kingdom not easily subdued. But the British returned with greater force. In 1874, Kumasi was captured and looted in a brutal expedition. Palaces were torched. Sacred objects including state regalia and gold ornaments were seized and shipped to London. As spoils of war, the heart of the empire was violated, but not yet broken. Segment 16, The Golden Stool and the War of the Golden Stool 1900, the final blow came not from guns but from arrogance. In 1900, British Governor Frederick Hodgson demanded to sit on the Golden Stool, the soul of the Ashanti people. The request was more than a provocation, it was spiritual desecration. The stool was not a throne. It was a holy object never touched by mortal flesh, believed to house the spirits of past, present and future kings. To demand to sit on it was to declare dominion not only over land, but over the very soul of a people. What followed was the War of the Golden Stool, a desperate, last-ditch rebellion led not by a king, but by a queen. Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ijisu, rallied the Ashanti chiefs and warriors when the male leadership hesitated. She rose in defiant speech, declaring that if the men would not fight, the women would. Her voice became a clarion call across Ashanti lands, igniting a grassroots resistance that laid siege to the British fort in Kumasi. Though ultimately the British would crush the rebellion with superior firepower and deport Asantewa and other leaders into exile, the spirit of Ashanti independence remained unextinguished. The stool was never found by the British, hidden away by Ashanti priests and guardians. Segment 17, Shadows and Legacies. By 1902, the Ashanti Empire was officially annexed into the British Gold Coast colony. The kingship was retained but stripped of sovereign power. British colonial administrators now governed, while the great palaces of Kumasi became echoes of a fallen realm. Yet, even in defeat, the Ashanti left behind an indelible legacy. Their goldsmithing traditions remained alive, their stories preserved by griots and elders, and their political acumen continued to influence local and national leadership in post-colonial Ghana. The Golden Stool remains a sacred symbol, its location and integrity preserved by ritual secrecy. It is not exhibited, not sold, not tarnished. It is revered. In modern Ghana, the Ashanti continue to play a vital cultural and political role. The Asantehene, though ceremonial, is a powerful traditional figure, bridging the ancient and the modern. Segment 18, Reflection, the ancestral weight of gold. In the heart of West Africa, where the forests touch the sky, and the rivers whisper of old gods, the Ashanti Empire stood a monument to wealth, spirit, and unyielding pride. Its story is one of splendor and shadows, of golden thrones that held no king, of women who became warriors, of battles waged not just for land, but for the soul of a people. The Ashanti taught the world that gold could be more than currency, it could be identity, memory, defiance. As the dust of empire settled and flags changed hands, the spirit of the Ashanti never bowed. It endures still in rituals, in language, in drumbeats echoing through the cocoa fields and city streets of Ghana. For in every glint of gold that emerges from the soil, in every tale passed from elder to child, the Ashanti whisper, "We were never conquered, we were only waiting." Segment 19, The Long Shadow of the Stool, Resistance, Legacy and Diaspora. As the 20th century dawned, the Ashanti Empire, though formally annexed by the British in 1902, refused to vanish into the mists of history. The Golden Stool remained hidden untouched, unclaimed by the British, and with it, the heart of Ashanti sovereignty pulsed quietly beneath colonial rule, though their king was exiled and their capital occupied. The spirit of resistance endured in quiet defiance and whispered tradition. The Ashanti legacy survived through the symbols it so fervently guarded. The Golden Stool, rediscovered by accident in 1921 but never sat upon, was returned to the people under carefully negotiated circumstances, its sanctity preserved. This act was more than symbolic, it was a reaffirmation of identity, a spiritual triumph amidst political subjugation, through the trials of colonial governance, economic exploitation, and the restructuring of West African society. The Ashanti adapted, resisted, and endured. British attempts to dismantle the Ashanti political framework were met with cultural resilience. The Asantehene title survived, re-established ceremonially in the mid-20th century, and today remains a prominent institution within modern Ghana. The echoes of the Ashanti past resonate not only within Ghana but throughout the African diaspora. Ashanti gold, art, folklore, and proverbs have traveled across oceans, carried in the memories of the enslaved and the descendants who reclaimed their heritage. Their stories live on in the rhythms of drum ceremonies in the Caribbean, in the bronze cast regalia of Pan-African festivals, and in the oral traditions of black communities in North America. In schools and archives, the Ashanti Empire is now studied not just for its clashes with Europe, but for the political sophistication of its councils, the philosophical weight of its oral traditions, and the sheer brilliance of its statecraft. The empire that once defied the British with drumbeats and spears now lives on in memory, museum, and movement. The Ashanti, once masters of gold and forest, remain masters of their legacy. Their pride was never just in their power, it was in their unity, in their symbols, and in the way they remembered. Segment 20, Reflections Beneath the Stool, the weight of a nation's soul. To gaze upon the Golden Stool is to feel the pressure of centuries. It is not an empty seat, it is a vessel of memory. For the Ashanti, it held the spirits of all their rulers and the heartbeat of their people. It was never sat upon because it carried the weight of everyone. Empires rise on conquest, yes, but they endure on meaning. The Ashanti understood this. That is why they channeled gold not just into weapons, but into symbols, into the stool, into the sword, into the soul. The story of the Ashanti Empire is not just one of battles and treaties. It is a chronicle of identity forged under fire, of defiance carved in ivory and cast in bronze, of reverence as a political act. They remind us that sovereignty is not only defined by borders and armies, but by culture, memory, and unity. From the dense forests of Kumasi to the far-flung communities touched by their legacy, the Ashanti still speak through their descendants, their art, their resistance. They remind us that power can live long after kings fall, and that true wealth is not gold alone, but the courage to protect what gold can never buy, a soul.